morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our today's Brownbag-Session. Today, we proudly present you Florian Brossette. He's working in the UNESCO Black Forest Biosphere Reserve in Germany, and he's also a PhD candidate at the Chair of Societal Transition and Agriculture at the University of Hohenheim. Today, he's talking about the efforts to support sustainable farming in the southern Black Forests. So Florian, today we have the question for you: how can common mountain pastures in the Black Forest be sustained? So thank you very much for being with us, and we're looking forward to your lecture, and I start the screen sharing now.
Okay, thank you very much. Also from my side, thanks for inviting me to this session, and thanks for also being interested in the topic that I will present in the following. Thank you, Monica, for sharing my slides. We found out that I'm not able to share them because my employer does not allow me to install Zoom, so we are doing it with this mixed method. Monica is sharing her screen and I'm presenting. So the title of my presentation reads Viable Pathways for Grazing in Common Mountain Pastures, the case of the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve. I've already been introduced. I work for the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve in southwest Germany, and I'm there responsible for our land use unit. Before I start officially with the presentation, I just want to draw your attention to the picture you can see on the first slide, which features the typical landscape we have in the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve. I think those of you are all from Austria, so you know how a mountainous area looks like. You know the Alps. This is not the Alps, this is the Black Forest. Mountain ranges are high up until 1,400, nearly 1,500 meters of altitude. It's a medium mountain range, and it's very much characterized by this change of forest and open landscape. And this is something we want to preserve. So on the next slide, you could see a map of the location of the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve. We are located very much on the southwest in Germany, and actually also the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve is part of the Black Forest. It's not the entire Black Forest, it's actually the southern part of the Black Forest that was recognized in 2017 by UNESCO as a Biosphere Reserve. It is with this the most recent Biosphere Reserve in Germany. Even though there are 2 more Biosphere Reserves that are currently waiting UNESCO recognition that will soon take up our space on the list as the novel. So the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve is actually representing in Germany the landscape type, we call them always landscape types in Germany, of grassland-rich forest landscapes. So with this goes also our obligation or our responsibility of developing ways of preserving this traditional landscape. And one of the main issues we have in the Southern Black Forest, of course, this is all connected to land use, but our focus is rather on not only on forestry, but rather on agricultural practices, on grazing. And in order to preserve the traditional landscape, we need adapted grazing practices, and these are also responsible or necessary to preserve the high ecological value that this landscape or that pastures in this landscape sustain. We could also replace, and it would actually be more fitting, high ecological value by ecosystem services, because what farmers are actually producing there on what this area features is also a high cultural value for the region. 2 more words to the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve. It is, as I said, situated in the very southwest of Germany. It's only approximately 30 hours drive to the Swiss border to Basel and 1.5 hours to Zurich, 30 minutes to Freiburg in Germany and 1.5 hours to Strasbourg. So it's very close related to big industrial zones in southwest Germany and also in the bordering countries. And this is why it is always more attractive for farmers to work in industry than to commit to full-time farming. And this is also very characteristic of the farming structure. On the next slide, I show you another picture of a typical common pasture in the Southern Black Forest. And this is actually what makes us special compared to other regions in Germany. I think in the Alps, there are many regions where you still have what we call in German Allmende. So these are common property pastures, also sometimes forests. But in our case, it's mostly pastures that traditionally were owned by a community of farmers living in a certain region, and that were also used historically together. Nowadays, they are owned officially by the municipality, and we have various use situations. Sometimes we've got grazing collectives or grazing groups that are still collectively pasteurizing these pastures in summer, and sometimes it's also individual farmers who are doing it. And this is now I'm narrowing down the topic which I want to talk about today. We've got different pressures on the traditional farming structures we're having in the region. So most of them are part-time farmers. This is very special for the Black Forest. Our region, 95% of farmers are part-time farmers, and the average farm size is 20 hectares. So this is very much small scale in German standards. And we face different issues concerning the agricultural policy. I will talk about this also in the conclusion once more, so that agricultural policy as it is being implemented in the federal state of Baden-Württemberg, which is the government organization that is responsible for the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve, is not properly or to 100% adapted to the ecological, but also the farming needs of the region. Then there are huge requirements in investing in farming infrastructure, especially barns, but also machinery. And we always are challenged with finding the right land use intensity. In former times, there was complete overuse, exploitation of these pastures. And this is actually also how this ecological richness that we have in the region has been created. But nowadays, we suffer from too low stocking rates. And this means that, grazing is not intensive enough. And then we've got scrub encroachment. And if nothing happens, then the forest will be everywhere. And this is something we want to protect. We want to prevent, we want to protect open landscapes, not only for nature protection purposes, but also for the cultural value in the region. So on the next slide, I talk briefly about the project whose results I'm actually presenting today, and that I had the chance to lead in the last 3 years. The project, we called it the German title Allmende 2.0. This was a project that was initiated in 2019 and lasted for 3 years, so up until recently. And I was employed as a project manager. And right now I'm in a permanent position in the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve in the land use unit. So the goal of this project was, because the Allmende or these common pastures are somehow the main or the emblematic feature of our Biosphere Reserve, is to look at what must be done, what recommendations can the Biosphere Reserve give for adapted grazing and landscape sustenance, so to preserve this feature that we are having. And the project has a very much applied character. Initially, it was only to give these recommendations, what should we do, make a plan. But then we decided that we should not only have this purely applied character, but by looking also at it from a scientific perspective, taking on scholars' perspectives and also frameworks, we could actually very much also answer these questions, the regional questions, but also contribute by having a larger perspective also to scientific discussions at more an international level. So we had the idea of combining the research project with a PhD proposal that then was accepted, and somehow we found it's a good idea, together with Professor Bieling from the chair of Societal Transition and Agriculture at the University of Hohenheim. And the methods we are using for the PhD project are rooted in transdisciplinary sustainability sciences. So we found it very well matching to also the practical research questions we are having. We are using, for instance, the social ecological systems framework, which is an approach that tries to look at a system, for instance, the landscape, that tries to combine different aspects, ecological, economic, but also social aspects into one system, and tries to see how these interact. At resilience, everybody's talking about resilience nowadays. And also something that is very interesting in our case, that is easily, I think, transferable to the Alps, is the Ostrom design principles. So I will talk briefly on the next slide on the Ostrom design principles. This is a set of rules that has found to be relevant by Elinor Ostrom in featuring sustainable land use of common pool resources. So the idea was that there are certain rules or governance arrangements, let's say monitoring of certain actions that are taking place, or who's taking care of the resource and who's got the right to exploit it. These kinds of government rules were found by Elinor Ostrom while looking at different cases around the world and different historic perspectives to be not a guarantee, but often present when we had sustainable use of these resources. And this finding actually gained a Nobel Prize to Ostrom in 2008, I believe, in economics. And the reason why we looked at it again and from the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve is because in our situation, and this I think is not only the case of our Biosphere Reserve, but especially also in the Alps, is that we do not have the overuse situation anymore on which these principles were actually based upon. So they were looking at how do we prevent overuse of a resource, but we are looking rather how can we tackle the issue of underuse with this framework. So this is like more the scientific perspective. And then we looked at other frameworks that were somehow related. I named them previously, the resilience principles, and also socio-ecological systems framework, and looked at how can these help somehow to enlarge the perspective that Austrian design principles provide, but also how are they reinforcing one another. We conducted then expert interviews with pasture organizations, so those that are collectively grazing. And we did also an expert survey on what measures should be implemented to support common grazing in the regions. And some of the results we were then discussing in the article we published earlier this year are that, first of all, there's a design principle that is much connected with who's taking care of a resource and who's benefiting from it. And we suggest that in this understanding, we should frame the question of who's benefiting and who is contributing in a much broader way, and to include social boundaries that include other actors that are probably not taking care but that are benefiting from it. And this is something that is missing in our case. So I will talk about this again, I think also in the conclusion. Something that is very relevant for our situation. Everybody's taking advantage of the nice landscape we have, local population, but also tourism. But the only ones that are actually taking care of it is farmers. So this is like a disbalance we found, and I think that this should also be, we suggest that this should also be stressed by the Austrian design principles. Then on multi-level governance and increased connectivity between pasture organizations, but also actors should be better in order to support this common farming, which is like a traditional relic, but that still has some transformation potential that is important for the region in terms of its cultural value. And another finding, and this is probably not astonishing, agricultural policy, because it always tries to mainstream and disregards certain regional particularities, disfavors common pool resource management in the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve. One very concrete idea is that in order to be eligible for receiving agricultural subsidies, these pasture organizations must adapt to a certain legal framework that is recognized by German law, and not all frameworks are probably suitable for what pasture organizations used to do in the past. So now they have to adapt, they have to find this framework, and then there are liability issues and so on. And if they don't do it, they don't receive subsidies. This is one of the examples. And then in another more concrete research question on the next slide, we did not only look at this part of common pastoralism or common grazing, but now we try to look at the entire grazing sector, actually at the entire actual agricultural enterprise we have in the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve, and looked at the future of farming, and we try to frame this under this idea of resilience. So resilience, I think you all are familiar with the concept. It's the idea or the ability to withstand change and also to adapt from change or disturbances when they are occurring. So that's the idea of how transformative a system is. So the topic of this research was to somehow look at all the information we had available on farmers, and to look at the situation, ask farmers what actually needs to change in order to improve your situation and somehow make the system viable in the future. And then check this information we received with resilience principles. And these resilience principles are like certain ideas of which action or what idea, if you implement it in, let's say in the farming sector, this would improve the capacity to transform when faced by disturbances. And these resilience principles are from Biggs and others, 2015. That's just one of the examples. There are several around to somehow analyze disturbance. How we went about this, and I'm actually very happy that we could do it in this way. We suggested to farmers that we provide counseling advisory services to them. So we had was one-on-one advisory sessions. Somebody who was skilled went out to the farms, and farmers could ask all issues that were relevant to them. What can I do, for instance, to better commercialize the meat I'm producing? Or how can I invest in this area? How can I better connect to my neighbors? And from these advisory sessions, we also linked them to a questionnaire and collect data from farms. And we had 44, I think, or 42 farmers participating to this proposal. And then with the another half, like with 20 farmers, we also conducted interviews that were more concerned with what is the future of farming in general in the region. And from this information we retrieved, we identified then a couple of measures or ideas of what should be done by policymakers or by the region in order to improve farming, the situation of farmers. And what we found, and I think that's something that is very nice to stress, it's something that has already been discussed in literature several times, but we found that what actually farmers said was important to them was also favorable while looking at it from the resilience perspective. So in other words, farmers' ideas are to a very large extent implementing resilience. And so we can actually argue from this that listening to farmers, to what farmers have to say, is very important from a policy perspective or in a governance perspective. That's not an innovative finding, but it's important for people in the region that they are being heard, that their voice must be heard. There are some central elements that were found in all these measures that were proposed to support farming. And these elements are that improved networking between the farming sectors. Most of these part-time farmers, they're quite isolated. They don't have time also to engage with their neighbors, even though it would be very helpful in doing so, because they are all faced with the same challenge. Increasing learning. We have the situation that there are no learning facilities within the biosphere reserve. Farmers have to go to the nearer cities, 1 or 2 hours driving away, in order to get appropriate training. And also to expand participation. This touches upon the idea I mentioned earlier. Not only farmers should be responsible for maintaining the landscape, we also have other actors that might do so. And looking at the time, I think I have to speed up, and I think I want to conclude, so you can also have time to maybe ask 1 or 2 questions on the last slide. So the question was, Monica? The last slide is coming. So the question was, how can common mountain pastures in the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve be sustained? And the answer is never as easy as it might be. So we believe there must be a coordinated approach and multi-level support. Traditional small-scale farming and part-time farming is still considered the best option in the biosphere reserves. I'll skip out why. And there are several levels of measures that must be taken, or several levels. I think this is the best word. There are current on-farm issues. Tied-up barns, which are still very much present and also like integrated in the traditional farm buildings we have in the region, will be prohibited in the future. So we need to find solutions for freestall barns, and this is very cost effective. So freestall barns are actually barns where animals can walk around as they want. They're not tied up to a flock. Workload is far too high for farmers, so we need to find solutions to decrease it. Work-life balance becomes more and more important also nowadays with farming in the Black Forest Biosphere Reserve. And wolf protection is an important issue. We have more and more wolf attacks, especially this year, and this of course creates very hard discussions within the region. Europe's common agricultural policy, there are also some issues. I think I will not go into detail about this, and anyway we don't know how it's evolving. Still we don't know, and next year already we have a new period and new agricultural subsidies or systems that will be supporting farmers. But I think the main point here is that environmental goals and production goals is usually what is behind the agricultural policy, must coincide. If we cannot support these areas that are particularly vital for ecological goals, then we have an issue, and currently we have this problem. And also if you look at the entire support system, I think in the future we have to change some things. We need to adapt to adopt local training that is suitable for farmers. We need also to think of how can farmers better be represented also within the agricultural union that is somehow not regarding what unproductive farmers in the Black Forest are doing, but that pay rather attention to industrial farmers in the Rhine Valley, for instance. And also look at how municipalities do allocate farmland to farmers. And the last point I think that is important to stress, in terms of future perspective, it is important to allow for diverse and innovative farming concepts, because nothing is perfect. There's climate change, there's societal change, and it's always good to have new and innovative forms. If you're more interested in this research, there are some written reports. There are 2 project reports of Amended 2.0. You can download them on our website with the Biosphere Reserve, and 2 articles more connected to the PhD process that have been published, one in German and the other one in English. You can see the identifiers here, and if you're interested in them, you can also contact me. I think I can send them to you. All right, and that's from my side. Thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, I think we've got a couple of minutes for discussions if you would like to.
Thank you very much, Florian, for this great lecture. I think we can see many similarities to our Austrian conservation areas. And I invite our audience just to turn on the microphone if you have any questions to Florian.
Will ensure nature conservation in the 21st century. Be part of the new 4-semester part-time master program. Carinthia University of Applied Sciences.